Hello and welcome to Township Talk. I am Scott Souther, the host of the show. On November 6, 2018, Michigan voters approved Proposal 1, making the sale and distribution of marijuana legal for the first time for recreational use. Over the next 2 episodes, Township Talk will be exploring this topic and what townships need to be prepared for. Hopefully along the way, we'll be collecting answers for some of the big questions you might have. In this first episode, we'll be speaking with Andrew Brisboe, Executive Director of the Marijuana Regulatory Agency. The MRA has been working to prepare Michigan for this new marketplace. Joining me behind the mic is Catherine Mulhalt, MTA Staff Attorney. I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to our listeners today. Certainly. I brought with us Catherine Mulhalt, who is MTA Staff Attorney. She, in many ways, is on the front line of the calls we're getting from township boards. As you can imagine, they do have some questions right now about what's going on. Now, this episode is going to air after November 1st. So can you tell our listeners to begin with why November 1st was an important date?
Well, we needed to pick a date to start taking applications for these facilities, and the statute required us to do it by December 6th. And we'd always wanted to do it more quickly than that. Having set up the process for accepting facilities for medical, or the applications for medical facilities, we had to do the same thing essentially over again. But having learned what we did the first time, having a lot of that infrastructure in place in terms of staff and IT systems, expanding it for that additional use from our side was much simpler. We needed to promulgate administrative rules to start the process, and we did that on July 3rd. That was really the heaviest lift for us, was getting those rules in place. And we really could have started taking the applications in July, if not for this provision of the Act that requires us to issue licensure unless there's a prohibitive ordinance by the municipality. So we heard from a lot of municipalities, and one of the reasons we have this commitment to outreach and collaboration is we need to know the other stakeholders in the game. And certainly municipalities are a big stakeholder in how this industry is going to unfold in the state, and they are given some of the authority under statute to determine where facilities are going to be, how many they want in their municipality. But talking to a lot of them, one of their big concerns was, what is the state level regulatory program going to look like? Because we need to know that before we can make decisions locally. So that's why we wanted to build in that 4 months, still be early. Because the sooner we start taking applications, the sooner that consumers can choose to use the regulated market to find marijuana products. We think the better that's going to be for the sake of health, safety, and welfare, and for trying to discourage black market operations or illicit sales.
Okay, great. Can you explain about the various types of licenses and how this approval process is going to take place?
So we have a lot of the same license types we saw on the medical side. We still have growers of 3 different sizes, though with slightly different plant counts, just to keep everybody guessing and not make it too easy for anyone there. We have processors, retailers instead of provisioning centers, but the same essential element there. We refer to them internally as sales locations broadly when we're talking about where you actually go to purchase products. Secure transporters, safety compliance facilities still there. But on the adult use side, we also have the micro business, which is a new license type. We've seen that in a couple other states now as well. That's someone who's going to grow 150 plants but do all their own processing and sales under one roof. It's a good small business model we expect to be utilized by new entrepreneurs who might not have the wherewithal to operate a larger vertically integrated operation. And then we also have authority to create some other license types under the statute, and we've exercised that authority in the emergency rules to create an excess grower license. That's going to allow someone that has their cap of 5 Class C grower licenses to grow some additional plants, but ties it back to their cultivation on the medical side as well. So we'll continue to see the production of plants and products in the medical market also. We have designated consumption facilities. We approached that in the rules as we saw that was a burgeoning issue in more mature markets throughout the country. This concept of people wanting to utilize marijuana products, not necessarily at home, and where they're supposed to do that, and determining ultimately that was going to happen. Whether we regulated it or not, people are going to be consuming products away from home. So we wanted to have some level of regulatory oversight over facilities where that was likely going to be occurring. Give them a pathway to licensure and sort of a plan on how to do it in a way that's safe, particularly for people working at those kind of facilities. That was one of our primary concerns. They're going to be potentially exposed to an environment where people are smoking marijuana for an 8-hour shift, and what what we might need to consider for their health, safety, and welfare as well. And then we have 2 licenses that work toward achieving licensure for temporary events. An event organizer license, which is someone who is licensed for the purpose of putting on temporary events, and then the temporary events themselves. And those would be circumstances where individuals can consume products at an event that is temporary in nature, less than 7 days in length. And those have to be approved by municipalities as well. And again, that's something that has been occurring in Michigan for a number of years now, and we thought it prudent to have some state level and local oversight of those types of events.
Okay. So, and all these licenses will be available after November 1st?
November 1st is the day. We'll start taking applications for all of those.
Okay.
Those that are new to the game, so not licensed on the medical side, we're encouraging to take advantage of our 2-step process because the ballot initiative requires that we make a decision within 90 days.
Okay.
And I think that was instituted and written into the law to make sure that there wasn't so much bureaucratic red tape and slowing down the process. But I think the reality is that's a bit of a burden on applicants to ensure that they can get not only their background investigation done, get us all the materials we need, but have a facility ready for inspection and operation within 90 days is a very short time frame. So we're encouraging applicants to submit their application, what we call the Step 1 or pre-qualification application, first, so that we can do the background investigation, let them know that they meet the baseline criteria for eligibility, and then they can tell us what the facility is going to look like so that 90-day clock doesn't start until we're actually looking at the facility itself.
Okay. So if a township has prohibited recreational marijuana, is that the end of the story for that township?
No, that's and we've seen, we're up over, I think, 1,200 municipalities now that have adopted ordinances to prohibit adult use facilities. And I think a lot of them are doing that just to kind of hold their place in line at this point, to make sure that they maintain the status quo. Some want to see how this unfolds. Some may need a little bit more time to consider how they're going to approach it locally, but they can adopt another ordinance at any point to allow for facilities under whatever restrictions they like, as long as those don't conflict with the state level program. So I expect we'll see some evolution there over time.
Okay, so we will see, there is, let me move back a little bit more back to the November 1st date. So if people prohibited recreational marijuana before November 1st, that impacted the licenses that were coming after November 1st.
Correct. So one of the steps in our review process when we see an application is going to be, and we're mandated by the law, to reach out to the municipality and say, we have an application by this person for this type of facility in your municipality. What ordinances do you have that impact that, or do you have an ordinance? Mm-hmm. And if they respond and say yes, and that facility is prohibited under the ordinance, that's going to be a denial from the state level as well.
Okay.
The big difference between the medical side and the adult use side is if they tell us we have no relevant ordinances, on the medical side, that means you can't have a license. On the adult use side, once you meet the other criteria, we have to issue a license. So that's the most important thing, I think, for municipalities to know. We were preaching on the medical side that inaction means no facilities, and it could potentially mean the opposite in the adult use space.
Okay, but they can still prohibit after November 1st. I mean, they can still pass an ordinance after that. Now, if there was a license that came in around that time period, what occurs during that process?
Well, the way the law is written, it's whether on the date of application, that facility would violate the ordinance. So if we receive the application on November 1st and the municipality adopts a prohibitive ordinance 15 days later, we wouldn't be able to apply that prohibition to that facility who applied on November 1st.
Okay.
For that license for that year. Correct.
And that application is still subject to all those conditions. And I think one of the challenges, and where we've been trying just to be a point of clarity and to provide some education, is we're hopeful that business operators don't try and set up shop in a municipality where they don't know that they're welcome. Because to Catherine's point, when it comes time for renewal and we say, what ordinances do you have? And they say, well, it prohibits this facility that's already there. Undoubtedly, we're all going to end up in court litigating that. So we'd rather avoid that. And so we've been encouraging applicants to communicate with their municipality to understand what their perspective is. And I'm hopeful that will be the case, that when we receive those applications, they'll be from facilities located in municipalities where they're expecting them to apply and they know that they're operating there.
Okay. Over the summer, there were some emergency rules released around recreational marijuana that I believe are only in effect for 6 months. What are in those rules now, and what does that 6-month time frame mean for the future?
Sure. So we should have the essential elements of what's necessary for us to implement the program in those emergency rules. So some of the things we discussed before, those new license types are defined there in their scope of operation, testing standards, processes, standards for edible infused products. Everything that we did on the medical side, we have the same components in the adult use emergency rules as well. The 6 months is relevant because that's all the time that's allowed under the APA for emergency rules, but we can get a 6-month extension. So it was a part of the discussion when we were ready to promulgate those in July was, well, we're going to promulgate these, and if we don't take application until November, we really have 4 months where they're just sitting there not really doing anything. But we thought it was imperative for the education of the municipalities for them to have a stable environment, for them to know what those look like. So it's likely when those expire in January, there'll be a 6-month extension.
Okay.
In the meantime, in the background, we're working on a permanent administrative rule framework that will apply to both the medical and adult use market. Okay. Because the other thing that's happening is our medical rules that are in place for those facilities, those have a 2-year sunset that's up this November as well. So our new rules package, and there'll be 10 rule sets that address topic-specific elements for both types of facilities in both markets. We expect those to be published in draft form around January, and we're hoping to have those officially promulgated by May, and then those will supersede all the rules in place, and that will be this permanent framework that we'll use on an ongoing basis.
Okay, all right. Now, if a township does allow recreational marijuana in their community, what is their role around that? What kind of oversight do they have, the township boards?
Well, they have some degree of latitude in determining how proactive they want to be.
Okay.
So the one restriction in the statute is they can't have any ordinances that conflict with the state law or the state regulations. I think that's one of the reasons that they wanted to wait to see what we were going to do as well. But they have authority to regulate the time, place, and manner. They can look at elements of signage, though I know in speaking with some of the groups from municipal organizations that becomes a bit of an issue. There's a bit of a history there with trying to restrict signage in some ways, but they do have that provision under the Act as well. And I think we'll see them approach it a variety of different ways. They can collect up to $5,000 to offset their fees. And what we've seen on the medical side, I think we'll probably see repeat on the adult use side as well. That in some cases they'll just authorize the facilities broadly. In other cases they'll be very specific about the number of facilities, about how they zone them and where they want them to be. So really it's up to the municipality's discretion as to what's best in that local jurisdiction and how they want to approach it. From our perspective, it's all been about educating municipalities about what the state's going to do and the areas we're not going to touch on. And there may be other areas as the industry evolves that the state gets involved in, so we have a consistent statewide approach. But until we do, that may be something municipalities want to look at. Odor control comes to mind, where I know some municipalities have taken that on.
And do you have does the department have any guidance on that issue in particular? That is one of the ones that we're hearing from communities that even may be supportive of having facilities. They're concerned about the odor.
So I think other states and some municipalities have tried to take that on. One of the reasons we didn't, on top of the fact that there are so many other issues that are extremely prevalent in the industry that we felt like we needed to approach, was there a good body of evidence to say the right way to go about it. When we look at how we want to regulate things, we want there to be an approach that can be consistent, that we ensure is actually addressing the problem and not just creating cost to businesses for the sake of appearing to do something that addresses that concern. So if I had an answer that I knew was appropriate in all circumstances, we probably would have done it already. So the short answer to that question is no. I don't really have the best guidance on how to approach it. But we know that it can be a concern of some of the neighbors. Overwhelmingly, we've seen that the industry is willing to be a good partner in addressing some of those concerns. So hopefully that won't be a huge issue for municipalities.
If I can
go right ahead.
Question on, you mentioned enforcement, on the aspect of investigations, inspections, and other aspects of enforcement. I know some townships were thinking, this will be like liquor control, we'll be able to do inspections on the local level. I'm not sure, is that the way the state is approaching this? So
we're approaching it that we handle the state law and the administrative rules we administer. And we'll conduct inspections. So from the MRA regulatory side, we'll be in the facilities twice annually for routine inspections. In the medical market so far, we've been in the facilities much more frequently than twice annually, but that's sort of our baseline ongoing goal. Our partners at the Bureau of Fire Services will also be in the facilities twice a year. We have a high standard when it comes to the National Fire Protection Act that we've adopted. I think that's probably a higher standard for these specific facilities than you'll see adopted in most municipalities in their general fire code application.
And that's in the rules, right?
And that is in the rules, yes. Beyond that, I think our guidance to municipalities would be if you're going to do routine inspections, it should be for the application of your ordinance, not for the state level program. Certainly, if there are concerns a municipality sees, they can escalate that to us, and then we can go check the facility. But the jurisdiction to apply the law and the rules is at the state level.
Sure. Thanks.
Okay. We talked about some of this already, but what else should townships be aware of when it comes to the legalization of recreational marijuana, besides just the retail business aspect of it? What else should they be aware of?
I think one point that I've tried to drive home in all the presentations I've done around the state for all sorts of groups is that we really have two markets that will evolve in the state in the adult use space. The regulated market that has oversight through state licensure as well as municipal control, but then we'll also have these provisions that allow individuals to grow at home and produce their own products. And I think sometimes there's still a misperception that those home grow operations, if you will, are subject to state requirements when they're not. We have no authority to go inspect home grows. They don't have to test those products. And that's where I think a lot of the concern comes from members of the community. When we get complaints about grow operations and the smell, it's typically in residential areas where individuals are growing at home, and we have to say that's not really within our purview. Any violations there would be criminal violations. So I think it's important to understand that market is still going to exist. Okay. It still exists on the medical side as well, and it's not subject to that same level of state oversight.
Well, so there's nothing they can do about it if you live near a house like that.
Unless it's a criminal violation.
This is criminal.
But some of those areas on what is or isn't a criminal violation is fairly vague. Okay. I think it's going to have to be tested through the courts, as we saw with the 2008 ballot initiative. And I think largely speaking, local law enforcement is saying that's not really a priority for us because it's been legalized in the state now. Prosecutors have other issues that they have to deal with as well. So that's kind of a tough one to take on. And when concerned citizens are asking whose job is it to check on this, that's a hard question to answer. And we have to say at the state level, well, that's not really within our purview. Another aspect that I think is important to understand is we're still dealing in the state with an unregulated market that is persisting. Other states have seen that on an ongoing basis, and we're just starting to get our legs under us in this regulated market as well. So that's going to be a point of focus for our agency and some of our partners at the state level through the state police and the Attorney General's office. And this, we're not talking about someone that's selling dime bags on the corner anymore. We're talking about full-scale commercial facilities that are operating without licensure. Okay. And that's been an area that's been of some interest to us, sort of countering what I said before about that sort of perspective that it's legalized in the state now. Well, that's true, but I think when you look at why there are regulatory programs, the existence of a regulatory program is based on the concept that there's some interest in protecting health, safety, and welfare. And therefore, doing it in an unregulated manner compromises that health, safety, and welfare. So I have a long history in licensing and regulation, and we would submit criminal complaints against individuals operating as residential builders without a license or real estate professionals without a license because they aren't adhering to those laws and rules. So we still need enforcement for unregulated commercial operators as well. And so that's an area where we're starting to focus some attention, not only because those products aren't necessarily safe because they're not being subject to testing. We don't know where they're coming from, but it certainly hinders the success of the regulated market when someone in an unregulated space is operating just down the road from them.
Let's go back a little bit to the medical marijuana. Can you say something about the differences between the recreational marijuana and medical marijuana regulations?
So there aren't many differences, actually. Okay. We made an attempt in our administrative rules to harmonize wherever possible, and we're going to continue that effort in that new set of emergency rules that will be coming. There really is no inherent difference between the plants or the products in the statute, so we didn't create any distinctions in the administrative rules either. In the end, we're really just talking about the market where it can be sold and tax differences. So there is no excise tax on the medical side, but there's the 10% excise tax on the adult use side through the retailers. So that's a core difference from a consumer perspective. That will be the big difference. Product availability in the short term is going to be better in the medical market as the adult use market comes online. But we're already starting to see a decline in the number of registered patients with the advent of adult use marijuana. We were up to 297,000 patients, I think, at our peak last year, and we're already down to 276. So I think we'll see more participation from the consumer side in the adult use market when that's fully operational.
Okay.
And to add to that, I know the law and the rules accommodate co-location, stacking. So if there's an existing medical marijuana licensed facility, certain ones, the ones that are able to co-locate, and the licensee wants to do recreational marijuana as well, they still have to apply for the appropriate recreational facility license. There's no automatic, you can just do it without going through the process of getting the license. Am I correct on that?
Correct. Yeah, we still have, and it's sort of an odd construct that if you are, selling at retail, that you do need two different licenses to sell to both patients and to adult use consumers. But we have two different laws that
right.
require two different licenses. The ballot initiative was very clear that at the state level as well as at the municipal level, we couldn't prohibit their co-location. And when I saw that in the ballot initiative, I thought, well, we would have never intended to do that anyway. It makes perfect sense that you allow them to do that in the same space. But we've seen that in other states where you walk into a facility that is a retail operation and you have two different doors. You go to the medical
right.
side or you go to the adult use side. We thought, well, we don't really need to do that.
Right.
The sales have to be tracked separately because of the excise tax. But we wanted there to be a business-friendly environment. And, I think the idea that allowing those existing medical facilities to just expand the scope of their operation into the adult use market without a lot of retooling or hoops to jump through is what's going to make those products available more readily. And again,
right.
the availability in the adult use market and the regulated market will reduce the use of the illicit market, and that's the goal here.
Right. I just have heard concerns from some communities that people said, quote unquote, that there would not be the requirement for the additional license if you were already, and that yes. I wanted to just clarify that for.
I can assure you there will be, and if all you have is a medical license, if you're selling to anyone besides a patient or a caregiver on behalf of a patient, that's a violation of
yes.
that act and those rules. So, yeah, I think that's clear. And I think some people are misinterpreting that provision in the ballot initiative that says, the state of municipalities can't prohibit the co-location as being some exemption from licensure.
Exactly.
But I don't think that's a valid interpretation.
Right.
I don't think that means you don't have to go through the process. It just means we can't tell you have to open up a different shop next door.
Right. Thank you.
At the time of this recording, there's a news story going around about how there's going to be a delay in the recreational marijuana till like March and April. Can you explain a little more detail exactly what that is? Because it seems like there's some different information out there. Yeah,
and it's one of the questions we get asked pretty regularly is when are products actually going to be available? Because it's one thing for us to take applications November 1st. That's what we know for sure. I expect that we'll be able to issue licenses to certain businesses probably by the end of November, but certainly by the end of December. Okay. The real question then is, from a consumer's perspective, when can they actually go into a shop and make a purchase? And other states, as they transitioned, Illinois is a good example. They had a medical market where there were a certain number of state-eligible facilities. I think it's only like 13. It's not a big number. They then are going to allow those facilities on starting January 1st to just produce those products and make those sales in the adult use market. So just this immediate transition, take your inventory, but now you have a broader audience to which you can sell it. Our program is a little bit different in that we have to get these new licenses out. We don't have a cap on the number of licensees, so I don't have this known audience of licensees I'm working with. So we'll issue the licenses as quickly as possible, but the availability of product is driven by the market itself. We did build into the administrative rules the possibility to allow for the transition of product through equivalent license types. So let's say you're a grower and you have licenses on the medical side, you get licenses on the adult use side. In theory, we could open a window and define parameters under which they could move products from one facility to the other under those licenses. And that could happen for processors as well as provisioning centers and retailers. But as it stands now, the product available in the medical market isn't meeting the demand for patients.
Okay.
So I'm not inclined to let them move those products from that just for the sake of being able to sell them to a larger market when demand isn't being met for the patient needs at this point.
Okay, great. Thank you for explaining that. What are you seeing at the state level in terms of community reaction to recreational marijuana and what's coming up?
A couple of things I'll say that have been surprising. I am not surprised by the number of ordinances to opt out. I think some people will take that as some sort of indicator of this prohibitionist mentality, but the reality is on the medical side, there are 1,773 municipalities in the state. On the medical side, we've had 127 opt in. Well, that means we've had over 1,600 that haven't. So the fact that we have 1,200 municipalities opted out on the adult use side really isn't that big a surprise to me. Some of the things I have found somewhat surprising is that municipalities that have allowed for medical facilities not allowing for adult use facilities. I guess I was presuming that if they allowed the medical, that they'd make the transition into the adult use, but that hasn't been true across the board, with some very notable examples of some fairly large players in the space. But I think some of them are still trying to fine-tune how they want to approach it. So it's not that they'll bar them forever, it's just they need a little more time to determine how they want to approach it. One of the other interesting byproducts, and this has happened in a couple of examples, are municipalities that are adopting ordinances to allow for adult use, but not allowing medical. And I think that's really strictly, I don't think it's a philosophical approach. I think it's a pragmatic approach. They say, well, why should we have two different processes?
I think they think it's transitioning. And many people have relayed to me that they think medical is going away in the sense that there won't be any patients or caregivers anymore. They'll just transition. I don't know that that's true, but that maybe where some of that is coming.
I think the laws will still be on the books and will still issue licenses, but I think you may see over the long haul a transition of many of the patients into the adult use market. Again, using Colorado as an example, because they followed a sort of similar progression in their laws on a similar time frame, but a few years ahead of us, that they were up to about 130,000 patients at its peak. But with adult use or recreational facilities being available, now they're down closer to 70,000. So, that's a smaller market. There are still many licensees in the medical space in Colorado. But I agree with you. We'll probably see more of a transition to that market. So it'll still exist on paper. How much it'll be utilized, the desire for licenses in the medical space versus adult use, I think we may see that shift fairly quickly toward the adult use side.
And if a township has prohibited recreational marijuana at this time, they can always change that later on. It's not...
Certainly could.
Yeah. Okay.
And they're allowed to do that on the medical side as well. Again, it's you'll want to consult with your legal counsel, talk to the MTA potentially. If you have facilities operating and you're going to pull that ordinance out from under them, consider how that transition occurs to try and do it as eloquently and delicately as possible.
Okay. Well, one of the other questions I have, I wanted to talk about the social equity program. Can you say a little bit about that?
Certainly. So the ballot initiative requires us to develop a program to encourage participation by individuals from communities disproportionately impacted by marijuana prohibition and enforcement. So we conducted a survey and met with several work groups to talk about, that sentence certainly can be somewhat subjectively interpreted. So we wanted to understand how should we apply this. One, how do we identify those communities? What criteria do we use? And then what services do we provide? How do we tweak our program and the requirements to try and encourage that participation? And where we ended up, we identified 41 communities. We initially had 19, and we've expanded to 41 now. Whose residents are eligible for the program. And we offer fee reductions for the residents. We are also doing outreach and education programs in those areas, both providing information from our side about how to qualify for the social equity program, the licensure process, offering dedicated resources to participants from that program, and then coordinating presentations from other professional service providers and content providers, so other state agencies, attorneys, CPAs, individuals who operate establishments already to give some guidance on that process. But we're one piece of that, and I think there are two other pieces to that. The second is that we require all licensees, all applicants for adult use facilities to have their own social equity plan as well, to indicate how they can be participants in ensuring that those communities are beneficially impacted. And I think that's going to be a tremendous part of that program.
Okay.
We've already seen some very creative, innovative approaches as to what they can do. In the end, when we're trying to benefit those communities, licensure is one path, but owning and operating your own business isn't necessarily what everyone wants to do. But there may also be job opportunities through other licensed facilities, and we want to help coordinate that. And then the third piece, I think, is it's important for municipalities to consider, whether they're a social equity community or not, what they're doing to help provide opportunities for individuals that were impacted. So we identify communities based on marijuana-related conviction data as well as poverty limits, but certainly every community has individuals that were negatively impacted by the laws that were in place prior to 2018. So I think it's good to consider how a municipal ordinance, should you allow facilities and this type of operation, how it can benefit those individuals as well.
Okay. A little bit earlier you said you were talking about the tax around recreational marijuana. Can you say a little bit more about how that money is going to be shared?
Sure. So there's a 10% excise tax. It operates much like the sales tax on all purchases and the retail price of products being transferred. The 10% excise tax will first be used, if you look at the statute, to fund the operation of the agency. But in trying to do our part to fulfill the will of the voters, we're going to set our fees to try and recoup all the money that's necessary to operate the program so we don't dip into the tax revenue at all. But beyond that, there was a $10 million allocation from the general fund to launch the program, so that has to be repaid. And then the second step is that there needs to be $20 million allocated until I think it's 2022 or 2023, but for at least 2 years to FDA-approved research studies for utilizing marijuana to treat PTSD and prevent veteran suicide. So let's just assume that money exists for 2 years, so that'd be the next $40 million. And then once you get beyond those sort of one-time or two-time funding mechanisms, then you get into the permanent approach. Okay. And after that, it will be 35% to roads, 35% to schools, and then 15% each to counties and municipalities based on a prorated share of how many retail or micro business operators they have. So for those municipalities that allowed for medical facilities, that's a little bit of a change. The 3% excise tax on the medical side is gone, but that allocation was a prorated share based on the number of facilities. On the adult use side, it has to be retailers and micro businesses. So it's a little bit of a shift. And what we saw was municipalities that restricted the types of facilities on the medical side typically did not allow for provisioning centers specifically. So if that approach is taken in the adult use space and they don't allow micro businesses or retailers, they're going to lose that share of that excise tax distribution.
Okay. Well, our listenership is mostly township board members and township officials. And I'm just a general point, what are some key points that you feel that they should be taken away or they should know to maybe to educate their residents or answer questions they might have that we haven't already addressed?
Well, I think at a high level, we've certainly touched on those. The biggest point I try and get across is to educate yourself and understand that there needs to be understanding of this issue. Okay. I assume that many township board members, this is not a full-time job for them. And I'm sure many of them, when they decided to be on the township board, weren't assuming they were going to be thrust into the middle of such a politically divisive topic. Yeah. But it's somewhat unavoidable because of the language in the Act. It's important for them to know what their community wants and how they can approach it and what resources they have and what options they have in crafting their ordinances. So we're a little late in the game now because we're taking applications November 1st, but what I've been preaching since last year is look at the issue and understand how you might want to approach it because you can't sit on your hands or you might find it's on your doorstep and you're being reactive instead of proactive. We have a lot of information on our website about the license types, about the state regulatory program. I think it's very important that they engage with the Township Association, with their legal counsel, if they can avail themselves of that resource to understand how to approach it. There is a ballot initiative allowance at the local level in the state law as well. So that can be very challenging. We've already seen some things move forward to ballots in the local area. I'm not sure how often townships have,
There is no other initiative process.
Okay. I'd spoken to a municipal attorney, but then sort of backtracked because I wasn't sure he was right about that there's no other law on the books in Michigan.
Not of that nature for townships. Yeah. Cities and villages have an initiative process, but we have referendum. But this is the first time that many of our townships will be encountering people, including people who are not electors, individuals who might be non-residents, initiating a petition. It's our understanding, though, that would be initiating an ordinance to prohibit or state the number and types of facilities that would be allowed. Then if that passed to allow, the township would then adopt ordinances to do the permitting or the zoning. Yeah. But and because the way the law is written, there's no deadline or time frame like a referendum on a zoning ordinance that can only be done once and within a period of time. The township might adopt an ordinance. There might be an initiative to counter that, and there might be multiple initiatives. I'm hoping that the community, once communities decide what people want, that the dust will kind of settle. But there could be some flip-flops out there in some communities.
I think we've already seen one where a municipality, I believe, has an opt-out ordinance, but on November 5th or 6th, whatever election day is, they actually have a ballot initiative that's trying to reverse that. So, and again, if there are groups out there that are looking at the statistics from the statewide ballot initiative and targeting those communities that had a high number of voters who voted yes on Prop 1 and trying to push ordinances there, interestingly, the first 3 of those we saw all failed. So I think when you're looking at elected township officials, it's important to understand the will of the people there who may have looked at the statewide ballot initiative through the lens of not arresting people for possession anymore, but may have a very different mindset when it comes to commercial facilities in the community as well. And so it's just good to have that conversation. And just because it's politically sensitive, if you avoid it and try not to talk about it, again, you may have facilities on your doorstep or you may have a ballot petition in your hands that then you have to be reactive to in dealing with. And the threshold for moving those forward is relatively low. My favorite story is that small township in the upper lower peninsula. I think they had to get 14 signatures to put it to the ballot. So that's not a very high barrier for entry. And you'll get those same 14 people that'll sign the second one and do it again. So I think it's good to, the most important thing is to have the discussion, be willing to open up the topic, see what your residents think, and take an approach on it.
Okay. Do you have any more questions?
Just very quickly, industrial hemp. Could you explain why that's different from other marijuana? And who is regulating that? Right now, I understand that MDARD, the Department of Agriculture, is working on developing rules for licensing and has done maybe some pilot farms this year. But how do you see that going forward?
Sure. And in terms of what the differences are, as an attorney, you'll appreciate this, that it's a legal definition difference.
It is.
That is the difference. It is the same plant, it's just a different legal definition. So the only difference between industrial hemp or marijuana is it's still cannabis sativa L, but if it has less than 0.3% THC on a dry weight basis, then it's classified as industrial hemp and therefore not subject to our oversight as in terms of regulation. So the Department of Agriculture does have a pilot program. The federal farm bill that passed in 2018 sort of legalized industrial hemp. The USDA is working on requirements for state-level programs. They'll set sort of the baseline, and then state programs can be more restrictive than that, I believe, is the approach. But they haven't done that yet. So there is no way for there to be a full-blown state regulatory program yet. So the Department of Agriculture in Michigan, MDARD, has the pilot program. They issued over 700 licenses in about a month and a half to growers in the state that planted fields of hemp. I want to say they had 23,000 acres or something. It was quite a lot of product being grown. And the end result of that then in terms of testing is they have to have it tested to ensure it's below that 0.3% threshold. But they don't have authority in the Act then to talk about what can be done with it, what the standards are for products being produced. And all those CBD products you see everywhere now are largely produced from industrial hemp. A lot of them I don't think in Michigan. I think they're coming from out of state at this point. But that's the primary market and use for hemp. But it has a lot of other uses. That seems to be the primary focus at this point, the most profitable outlet for those products. So a lot more to come there. One of our 10 rule sets that I mentioned will be coming forward soon is industrial hemp for marijuana licensees, because the Industrial Hemp Research and Development Act, as well as the Medical Marijuana Facilities Licensing Act, allows for licensed processors in our market, as well as the safety compliance facilities, to do processing and testing.
Okay.
So we needed some guidance on how they played that role and what the standards were. One of the concerns we have with the overlap of those two markets is, again, you're looking at the same plant. So if you looked at it on site, you're not going to know what's hemp versus what's marijuana.
Sure. And
we very tightly control marijuana, and hemp's kind of over here doing its own thing at this point. So, we want there to be clarity on how licensees can do things the right way. You can't expect business operators to abide by rules that they can't follow or understand, so we want to provide some clarity there. And I think there'll probably need to be some legislative cleanup done for MDARD's program, so they have better authority to determine what to do with the products and how that's going to unfold. But that's just been moving very rapidly, and so I think there's a lot more to come. I think the hemp market in Michigan is going to be a very robust market, and we just need to define what those standards look like, how the facilities operate, and from a public safety standpoint, we have a lot of requirements for products that are going to be utilized by consumers, both topicals as well as ingestible materials, and I think they need similar standards in the industrial hemp market as well.
Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you so much for meeting with us today.
My
This
pleasure.
has been wonderful.
Great.
Thanks. I would like to thank Andrew Brisboe of MRA for joining us today, as well as Catherine Mohalt of MTA. You can find MRA and keep up to date with their important information at michigan.gov/marijuana, as well as on their social media accounts. If you have any suggestions for future episodes, or if you have any questions about the show or the topics we covered, you can find us at michigantownships.org. Thank you for listening to Township Talk.